My beloved child, before your thoughts carry you somewhere else, remain here for just a little while. There is a quiet reason these words have found you at this exact moment, and perhaps, without realizing it, your heart has already been waiting for them. Don't skip, not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because something meaningful may finally begin to make sense. There are moments in life that arrive without noise, without warning, and yet they gently change the direction of everything that follows. This feels like one of those moments. Imagine receiving a letter that was written long before you knew it existed, a letter that somehow understands the questions you have never spoken aloud. That is how this message wishes to meet you today. It does not rush toward you. It simply waits, hoping you will notice the quiet truth resting between each sentence. Somewhere, another heart has been carrying thoughts that have become too heavy to ignore. Not because everything has gone wrong, but because silence has lasted longer than either of you expected. There are feelings that become clearer the longer they remain unspoken. They do not disappear. They become more honest. And perhaps that is why these words begin with such urgency. Please open this before I make the biggest mistake of my life. Yet the mistake is not what you might imagine. It is not anger. It is not blame. It is the possibility of walking away from something that still deserves one final moment of understanding. Sometimes people convince themselves that letting go is easier than being vulnerable. They smile while quietly wondering whether they were misunderstood all along. They move forward while secretly hoping someone will notice they never truly left emotionally. If that sounds strangely familiar, stay till the end, because something important is waiting for you. Have you ever noticed how certain memories refuse to fade, no matter how many new days arrive? They appear unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, during a quiet drive, while looking out a window, or hearing a song that carries no obvious connection at all. Those memories are not trying to trap anyone in the past. They simply remind us that some connections leave gentle fingerprints on the soul. The person this story speaks of has reached that place where every attempt to ignore those fingerprints has quietly failed. They kept telling themselves tomorrow would feel different. Tomorrow would finally bring distance. Tomorrow would silence the questions. Yet tomorrow kept arriving with the same quiet whisper. What if I am walking away from someone I was never meant to stop believing in? That question has become impossible to outrun. It appears during peaceful moments rather than difficult ones. It interrupts certainty with unexpected tenderness. It reminds them of conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but now shine with new meaning. They remember laughter they did not fully appreciate. They remember words left unfinished. Most of all, they remember the feeling of being understood without needing to explain everything. That kind of memory is rare. It cannot be replaced simply by meeting new people or filling every empty hour with distractions. It patiently waits until the heart becomes quiet enough to recognize its value. There is another detail that has remained hidden until now. The greatest turning points rarely begin with grand events. More often, they begin with one honest realization. One pause. One unexpected moment when someone finally admits they have been pretending to feel stronger than they truly are. That realization has arrived. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It arrived like the first light before sunrise, almost unnoticed, until everything slowly became easier to see. And once that light appeared, something changed forever inside them. They stopped asking whether these feelings were real. Instead, they began asking why they had waited so long to face them honestly. Perhaps you have experienced something similar in your own life. Perhaps there has been a season when your heart quietly carried answers your mind kept delaying. Maybe that is why these words feel strangely familiar instead of distant. Sometimes two different journeys quietly reach the same crossroads without either traveler realizing it. That is what makes this moment feel so significant. Not because everything has already been decided, but because understanding often arrives just before important choices are made. The message remains unfinished for a reason. Some truths reveal themselves only when the listener is willing to stay with them a little longer. There is still one quiet confession that has not yet been spoken, and everything that follows depends on those few honest words. They have rehearsed them countless times, yet every attempt has ended with silence instead. What those words are, and why they matter more than anyone realizes, is about to become clear. There is something remarkable about the moment just before someone finally stops hiding from their own heart. It does not arrive with certainty. It arrives with quiet hesitation, with long pauses between ordinary moments, with a feeling that refuses to disappear no matter how many times it is ignored. That is exactly where this story continues. Somewhere, the words that have remained locked away are no longer content to stay unspoken. They have waited through restless nights, through busy days that never truly distracted anyone, through conversations that sounded complete while leaving the most important sentence untouched. Stay a little longer, because this is where everything begins to reveal a deeper meaning. The message they have carried is surprisingly simple, yet it feels heavier than anything they have ever tried to say. It begins with an apology. Not because someone failed beyond repair, but because they finally understand the value of what was quietly slipping away. Sometimes people believe they have endless time to explain themselves. They convince themselves that tomorrow will always offer another chance, another conversation, another beginning. Then one ordinary day they realize tomorrow has become much smaller than they imagined. That realization changes everything. They have replayed countless memories, not searching for mistakes alone, but searching for moments they overlooked. A smile they never thanked you for. A kind word they answered too quickly. A silence they misunderstood. A goodbye that should have lasted just a little longer. Funny how the smallest moments become the brightest when viewed through the lens of hindsight. Those memories no longer feel ordinary. They feel like gentle reminders that something meaningful was growing long before either of you recognized it. And then came the realization they never expected. It was not another person who changed their perspective. It was not a dramatic event. It was peace. For the first time in a long while, everything around them became quiet enough to hear the truth inside their own thoughts. In that silence, one name continued returning with calm persistence. They tried to replace it with new plans, new routines, new goals. Yet every path somehow curved back toward the same quiet question: why does this still matter so much? Questions like that are rarely answered immediately. They simply remain, patiently waiting until honesty becomes easier than avoidance. Perhaps that is why this message feels so urgent now. Not because anyone wishes to rush the future, but because some opportunities deserve to be met with openness before they quietly drift beyond reach. There are seasons when people protect themselves so carefully that they accidentally hide from the very happiness they have been hoping to find. They build walls believing they are creating safety, only to discover they have also hidden the doorway. The heart behind this message has finally recognized that difference. Something important is waiting for you, and it is not a perfect ending already written. It is the possibility that understanding can still grow where silence once existed. That possibility is gentle, but it is powerful. It asks for patience instead of certainty. It asks for listening instead of assumptions. Most of all, it asks both hearts to stop pretending they have forgotten what they have quietly carried all along. There is still one detail they have not shared. Every time they imagined finally speaking to you, the same thought interrupted them before the first sentence could even leave their lips. It was not fear of rejection. It was something far more personal. They worried that too much time had passed, that perhaps you had already found a new direction, a new peace, a new chapter that no longer had room for them. That single uncertainty has kept them standing still while life continued moving around them. Yet today feels different. Not because every answer has suddenly appeared, but because they have finally accepted that unanswered questions are lighter than lifelong regrets. And as that understanding settles into their heart, another confession quietly rises to the surface, one they have never spoken to anyone before. Those words have the power to explain why they called this the biggest mistake of their life, but that truth can only be understood once the final piece of their story is revealed. Strange, isn't it, how the heart often recognizes an important moment before the mind can explain why? There are quiet seconds that seem completely ordinary on the outside, yet inside they carry the feeling that life is gently shifting in a new direction. This is one of those moments. Nothing is rushing forward, and yet everything feels closer than it did before. Stay with this for a little longer, because the meaning hidden beneath these words is only now beginning to reveal itself. For a long time, they believed strength meant remaining silent. They thought that if they kept every feeling carefully hidden, eventually those feelings would become smaller. Instead, the opposite happened. Every unspoken sentence became clearer. Every unanswered question grew gentler but more impossible to ignore. They finally understood that silence can protect the heart for a while, but it can never truly satisfy it. Sooner or later, honesty begins knocking from the inside. That is why this message exists. Not to ask for perfection. Not to rewrite every yesterday. But to say something that should have been spoken much sooner. If I lose the chance to tell you what you truly mean to me, I may spend the rest of my life wondering what could have happened if I had simply been honest. Those words were never meant to create pressure. They were meant to create peace. Because there comes a moment when carrying the truth becomes heavier than speaking it with kindness. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. They stopped remembering only the extraordinary moments. Instead, it was the smallest memories that stayed alive. The way a conversation felt effortless. The comfort of simply knowing you were somewhere in the world. The feeling that even ordinary days carried a little more warmth because you existed within them. Those memories refused to fade because they were never built on excitement alone. They were built on quiet presence. And quiet presence often lasts longer than loud promises. Perhaps you have experienced that feeling yourself. You move through your routine, believing life has settled into its familiar rhythm, and then one tiny reminder changes everything. A familiar phrase. A favorite place. A peaceful evening. Suddenly, someone you thought had become a distant chapter feels surprisingly close again. Not because the past is pulling you backward, but because your heart has finally caught up with what it always knew. That realization has brought them to a crossroads they can no longer ignore. They have asked themselves the same question again and again. What happens if I remain silent one more time? Each time, the answer felt emptier. Not because silence is wrong, but because this silence would no longer be honest. Something important is waiting for you, and it has nothing to do with dramatic promises or impossible expectations. It is much simpler than that. It is the quiet courage to choose truth over uncertainty. To choose openness over endless guessing. To allow one sincere conversation to exist where countless imagined conversations have already lived. There is another reason they called this the biggest mistake of their life. It was never about choosing another path. It was never about meeting someone else. The mistake they feared was allowing pride, hesitation, and perfect timing to become more important than expressing genuine care. They realized that life rarely waits for the moment we imagine. The perfect words almost never arrive. The perfect circumstances remain just beyond reach. Yet meaningful connections have never depended on perfection. They have always depended on sincerity. That understanding changed them more than they expected. Instead of asking, "What if I fail?" they began asking, "What if kindness spoken today becomes the beginning of something beautiful tomorrow?" That single question brought them more peace than months of overthinking ever could. And now, standing quietly between hope and uncertainty, they have made a decision that only a few days ago would have seemed impossible. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. But it is real. Before another sunrise passes, they intend to do something they have imagined countless times but never found the courage to begin. What that first step is, and the words they have carried in their heart all this time, are finally ready to be revealed. There comes a point when waiting no longer feels wise, it simply feels unfinished. That quiet realization settled over them like the first light of morning, gentle enough to bring peace, yet clear enough that it could no longer be ignored. For the first time in a long while, they stopped imagining every possible outcome. They stopped trying to predict every response. They simply allowed themselves to admit one beautiful truth: some connections are worth honoring, even if the future is still unwritten. The words they have been carrying are no longer hidden. If you are reading this, I hope you know I never stopped appreciating what your presence brought into my life. I only became aware of its depth after I spent too much time pretending I was unaffected. I thought distance would make everything easier to understand. Instead, it showed me how much quiet joy I had overlooked. Those sentences were rewritten countless times. Sometimes they sounded too careful. Sometimes too emotional. Sometimes too incomplete. Eventually they realized the heart was never asking for perfect wording. It was simply asking to be honest. And honesty has a remarkable way of bringing peace, even before it changes anything else. As they looked back, they noticed something they had missed for far too long. Every meaningful memory shared one simple quality. Neither of you had been trying to impress the other. The best moments happened naturally. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A laugh that appeared without effort. A silence that never felt uncomfortable. Those are the moments that quietly build trust. They are easy to overlook while they are happening, yet impossible to forget once they are gone. That is why this message feels different from every thought they kept to themselves before. It is no longer driven by uncertainty. It is guided by gratitude. Gratitude for every lesson. Gratitude for every smile. Gratitude for discovering that some people quietly leave a lasting mark simply by being themselves. Perhaps life has been teaching you something similar. Sometimes what seems delayed is simply becoming clearer. Sometimes what feels uncertain is quietly preparing both hearts to understand each other in a way they could not before. Growth is rarely loud. It happens in ordinary moments, hidden beneath everyday routines, until one day you realize you have become someone who sees with greater kindness than before. Don't skip this final stretch of today's journey, because there is one last realization that changes the meaning of everything you have heard. The biggest mistake was never choosing the wrong person. It was almost choosing silence over sincerity. It was almost allowing fear to write the final chapter of a story that still deserved one genuine conversation. Now that fear no longer holds the pen. Hope does. Not the kind of hope that demands a particular ending, but the quiet hope that believes honest words are always better than lifelong wondering. So wherever this message finds you today, let it remind you of something gentle yet powerful. The most meaningful connections are rarely built through perfect timing. They grow through patience, understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to speak with an open heart when the moment finally arrives. And somewhere, as this chapter quietly comes to a close, another one is already beginning. A conversation that once lived only in imagination is now closer than ever to becoming real. The next words spoken between two hearts may not change the entire world, but they may change the world those two hearts share. One honest sentence at a time. Every meaningful journey eventually arrives at a place where silence gently steps aside and understanding takes its place. This is that place. Nothing extraordinary has appeared from the outside, yet everything inside has become clearer. The questions that once seemed endless have slowly transformed into quiet certainty. Not certainty about every tomorrow, but certainty about what deserves to be said today. If this message could end with only one truth, it would be this. I never wanted perfection. I only wanted the chance to be real with you. Those words carry no expectations. They carry no conditions. They are simply the most honest reflection of a heart that finally stopped hiding behind hesitation. There were days when they convinced themselves that forgetting would be easier than remembering. They filled empty hours with new routines, new conversations, and new goals, believing that time alone would answer everything. Yet every peaceful moment gently led them back to the same realization. Some people become part of your story not because they were loud, but because they quietly helped you become more yourself. That kind of connection is never measured by how much time has passed. It is measured by how deeply it continues to inspire kindness, patience, and hope. So this is the message they wished you could hear before making what they feared would become the biggest mistake of their life. Thank you for being part of my journey. Thank you for reminding me that genuine care still exists. If our paths are meant to continue together, I will welcome that future with gratitude. If life asks us to walk different roads, I will still carry the lessons we shared with appreciation instead of regret. But before another chapter begins, I never wanted you to wonder whether you mattered to me. You did. More than I ever found the courage to say. Notice how different those words feel from fear. They are calm. They are sincere. They leave room for hope instead of pressure. And perhaps that is what real courage has always looked like, not trying to control the ending, but choosing honesty regardless of what tomorrow brings. Maybe there is something here that speaks to your own heart as well. Perhaps there are feelings you have quietly protected, conversations you have imagined, or moments you once believed had already slipped away. Life has a remarkable way of reminding us that understanding often arrives later than expected, yet still arrives exactly when it can be appreciated most. As this story gently comes to its close, remember one simple thought whenever doubt begins to whisper too loudly. The strongest connections are rarely the ones filled with constant excitement. They are the ones that leave you feeling understood. They are the ones that encourage you to become gentler instead of harder. They are the ones that continue to bring peace long after the conversation ends. And maybe that is why these words found you today. Not to predict your future. Not to promise an outcome. But to remind you that sincere hearts are never diminished by kindness, honest conversations are never wasted, and hope becomes strongest when it walks hand in hand with patience. So let this final page close with quiet gratitude. Whatever chapter you are living today, may you never be afraid to express appreciation while the moment is still here. May you choose understanding over assumptions, compassion over pride, and honesty over silence whenever your heart gently calls you toward it. Because sometimes the greatest mistake is not loving too deeply. It is believing that genuine words can always wait for another day. And sometimes the most beautiful beginning starts the very moment someone finally decides to speak from the heart.